Well, welcome back for episode 2 of Diary of a Trans Pediatrician. I'm Ashley, your host, and today I'm going to talk about a topic that's a little bit difficult to listen to, so I'm just going to warn viewers in advance. We're going to talk politics today. We're going to jump in the rabbit hole and talk about the upcoming election, the presidential election specifically, but politics in general is really what I want to cover today, and just kind of give you a perspective from the trans community, just what it's like to go through this process. And I also want to take you back to 8 years ago, the 2016 election, and kind of compare and contrast where I was then politically as far as how I identified versus today, right? And this is kind of the window into my life and my world, as I promised, as a part of this podcast. And I think this will help illustrate to just how much politics can affect our community, and also just how passionate most of us are, if not all of us in the community, about this, including myself. You know, the political realm is one that's can be very frustrating for anybody, but let alone for our community who is a minority. That's who we are. And we have laws passed in states right now that not only affect adult trans people, but kids. Kids are the population I see. That's the one who I worry about the most. And so this affects me in a couple different ways, right? It really does. And comparing that to what I was like and where I was 8 years ago, I think could be helpful just to see some of the differences and, you know, why things have changed during that time. Let's first talk about transgender Americans and equality or equity. And the reason I want to talk about this is because I think this really applies to the political realm, and I think it's important to talk about that first. So let's start with Transgender Day of Visibility earlier this year. That's something that's been celebrated for years now. The Biden administration recognized this year, put out a big letter or proclamation about it, and in that had some very kind words for our community. But there's a couple lines that stood out from that I'd like to highlight that are very important for our community today and really applies to everyone in the trans community. And, you know, that the biggest line that I will say is it says, "We are America," right? The trans community is America. And I think that's a really important concept in what he said. And the reason is because not only does that state we are normal like other Americans, we are mainstream, okay? We're not marginalized, not stigmatized, not pushed to the edge, but we are normal. You are America, right? That's the first message I hear in that. But the second message is the equity versus equality argument. And the reason I say that is because in highlighting us in this way on a day that highlights our community in a positive way, it really shows that the focus is on us and what we need. And so what we need may be different than others outside our community, right? But to get us on that level playing field, that's the equity argument. That's what we're striving for. And I really think that message is twofold and is a really important one to take home. So having said that, earlier this year, I also wrote a letter to the White House and received a response from President Biden. And it had very similar terminology, very similar words, very similar phrases in it to what he put out on Transgender Day of Visibility. You know, and those things are so important, I think, to not only highlight, but also to, you know, just think about, right, what that really means. And ultimately what the president has talked about and others have talked about, particularly in our community, that being a part of this nation, being a part of what everybody else goes through, being an American like all others, not stigmatized, not marginalized, not pushed to those edges, that is what we are striving for. Now, are we there based on one letter or message from President Biden? No, it's going to take a lot more than that, but that shows what we're looking for and striving for, right? And any marginalized group or minority, I think, strives for those things, right? We are trans folks. Okay, and our struggles and the things we go through compared to other minorities is different, but yet it is still important. And it's important to us, right? This is what we go through. This is our battle to go through. So having set that stage, I'd like to go back 8 years ago to when President Trump ran for office in 2016. And the reason I'd like to go back to that time is it was a different time in my life. At that time, I thought I was a male, more specifically a white heterosexual male, And in my last episode, I mentioned privilege. Well, that's that life I was getting at. This is the one. I lived that life and led that life for a long time. So at that time in my life, I was a conservative, a Republican, and I supported Donald Trump for president. Now, in saying this in my podcast, it is difficult to put out there and tell other listeners and people that today. And the reason being is because it feels like that I was betraying the values of really the trans community that I espouse today. But in looking back, I have also realized how much I have learned in the last 8 years, and that I have had the opportunity to see this from more than one perspective, right? Not just as a transgender woman, but also a person who lived a life of privilege. Now, I'd like to focus a bit on Donald Trump himself, and I'm going to try to keep this as PG as possible, right, today. This is passionate, that's how I feel, but I think it's important to highlight a couple things in a way that's constructive and could potentially be helpful to others. Much of what our transgender community has gone through in the last several years, the laws that have been passed in particular that limit the rights of trans youth to obtain gender-affirming care, and also limits on transgender people in general, adults, on our basic rights, those have a profound impact on our community. And I believe that those things have come because of the culture that Donald Trump represents. And, you know, I think Donald Trump represents somebody that sounds a lot like he's not a politician, right? And I think that he sounds like just another person you might talk to, in that it's easy to look over some of the things that he says or the things that happen, the fallout from those things because of that. I think a lot of Americans are desperate for change so badly that we would turn to a figure that does not oftentimes sound political. But the fallout from that is immense for a lot of communities, particularly minorities. I lived that life, that privileged life, right? Donald Trump has lived that privileged life as well. And part of that privileged life, I think, is the idea that a lot of the things that Donald Trump represents or says or talks about or jokes about in his rallies and on TV or in Fox News, all those things they're just funny, right? And that those things are not really going to happen in the future. And of course, this is a lot of things outside the trans community. It's not just us. But remember, when you are a minority, like trans people are, those words mean something. They represent a threat to who we are, because that is something we feel every day. Whether it's a speech on TV, it's something we read online, it's a proposed law that never passes in the state or federal legislature. All of those things affect us deeply, and it further perpetuates the fact that we are a marginalized and stigmatized group. It feels like a fact. That's what it feels like. And it pushes us further toward the edge of society. So although many of the things that he says and others in the Republican Party or those that are conservative may never come true, that doesn't matter, right? It isn't the same being a minority. It isn't the same being trans. We take those things that other politicians say very seriously when someone that leads a life of privilege may look at that and think, oh, it's funny, right? That's funny, haha. Now, it's not that simple, right? There isn't clear-cut categories between living a life of privilege and being a minority. You can be a combination of those things. But the point of this discussion is that those things have a massive effect on our community. They really do. And I think the idea that Donald Trump is going to save us or be better for the United States compared to, anyone else, right? I think is really based on that idea that he's not, right? He doesn't sound like a typical politician, but I can tell you right now, I haven't lived on both sides of it, having supported him at one time and now not being a supporter of his at all now. that rhetoric and those sales pitches, right? Because that's what they are, that he talks about, those inflict pain over and over again. It's like a knife that digs deeper and deeper. When politicians out there pass laws that restrict our freedoms in the trans community, and particularly the trans youth, I think that's a really good population to focus on, particularly with what I do. In my current job, I provide gender affirming care to kids. It's an incredibly important job. And I can tell you that those laws that are passed have far-reaching effects. I moved here from the state of Iowa to the state of Massachusetts, where the laws are very different when it comes to trans youth and their rights. And I've seen those differences right between the states. And I've seen the level of depression and anxiety and those levels of suicidal risk. I have seen those firsthand. And when it comes to the lives of our kids in our nation, and when we're willing to pass laws, I think, that limit those ability to be yourself, be who you really are on the inside, right? One of the cornerstones of something that's important to all of us. And again, in the last podcast, I mentioned a lot of us don't think about our gender identity, particularly if we're a cisgender person. But for those that are trans, it's different. And this is represented by the fact that those numbers of trans youth with depression, anxiety, are at risk for suicide are so high, right? And it is because of those limitations or lack of access to the care that those kids need. We know that treatment for specifically gender dysphoria, right? That is the diagnosis when one's gender on the inside is different than the one you're assigned at birth or have grown up being. We know treatment for that is extremely helpful, right? It helps with anxiety. It helps with depression. It helps prevent death. And isn't that our number one goal? Isn't that what we're here to do? Isn't that, as a mom, as a dad, as a parent myself, and as a pediatrician, as any American, the lives of our kids are incredibly important. So to use laws as political tools to inflict pain on all those around us is just flat out wrong. I think a lot of people in America don't know trans people. They haven't ever talked to a trans person. But I think the fact that those conversations and the ability to really communicate just hasn't happened. You know, and I think it's easy to think of trans people as these weird people that go against what you believe maybe ethically or morally. But the reality is that trans people have been around forever. Did we have a name for ourselves like we do today? No, the word trans has not existed forever. But we have been there and been here nonetheless. It's hard for me to put into words how terrible I feel about who I was in the past politically. I contributed to the problem, right? I did in the past. And I think that today, of course, things have changed, right? I'm trans, right? The way I view things is different. But people are dying out there because of words, laws, threats from others, particularly with our trans youth. Those are all realities. I remember when I was in medical school and we took the Hippocratic Oath. One of the things we talked about was do no harm. And those words were never truer than today when it comes to those people in the trans community that are at risk for suicide or have taken their life, right? Those loved ones that are now gone are never coming back, right, to this world. So the main reason I started this podcast was because building those bridges and communicating with not only allies and members of the trans and queer community is important, but it's also important for those that don't understand or don't support us right now, because that's how we'll come to an understanding and be able to talk better about things, put a human face to the things that we argue about, that we protest against, those types of things, and tell the story, right? Paint the picture of who we really are. And as opposed to a stereotype of a community, the trans community, one that's weird in a way or different and I can't relate to. In reality, we come from every walk of life. We do. Every background, every different type of job, different ages, right? Different ethnicities. All of those things are true with the trans community. And there's people right now out there that are trans, likely friends with somebody that's not supportive, and that person that's not supportive has no idea, right? That person passes, and they're just out in private, and that's it. So it's important to build those bridges. And the way we're going to do that is to talk about it, right? That's the way we're going to do it. And that's why I'm sitting here today. I also feel a sense of guilt. The fact that I supported not only a candidate, but a party that has said and done things against our community that are just horrendous, that I would spend every day of my life making a podcast and talking about this if it could affect change, right? And help our community, because that's how strongly I feel about it. Now, before I transitioned and before 4.5 years ago, as I talked about in the last podcast, I would look at trans people and think they looked weird sometimes. I did those things too. And I thought, wow, I don't understand. It doesn't make sense to me. But those same people now, when I see them, as I've gotten to know them better, as I've been in support groups and talked with them, do we all share the same values, have similar personalities, or things that we do that, things like that? No, we don't. Oftentimes we're very different. But I look at them in a very different light now. Those same people who I thought of as weird before, I see beauty. I see courage. I see someone that's willing to stand up for who they really are. And that's the real take-home message today. I was part of those people that didn't understand and didn't know people in the community before. But now, as I understand now, those same people, I celebrate. I lift them up. Because it is not only the right thing to do, but it is going to save lives. And isn't that my job as a physician, as a pediatrician, to do those things anyway? Literally, in my clinic, we save lives by providing services that help other kids. We have an election in less than 2 weeks. And I would just say to everyone out there that's listening that transgender people are normal. We are America, just like President Biden said. And for those that don't understand or don't support us, just take time to listen. The same thing I did the last several years. And you'll see a group of diverse people with various interests. But we're Americans just like you. It is often hard for us in the trans community to have a conversation about being trans with others. We've often gone through a lot of trauma in our lives, whether it's related to being trans or transitioning or other things in life. So it's often hard for us to open up and talk. But it doesn't mean that we can't or we won't. Just saying hi or asking how we're doing to someone that is trans can be incredibly helpful. It shows them that you care. In this upcoming election, there is a candidate that cares about us, about trans people. And there's one that does not. And this election is another way to show us that you care about us, right? For those out there that are listening. It's a chance to vote on what we value. It's a chance to vote against discrimination. And it's one more way to open that door to showing the trans community that it's okay to come out. It's okay to be yourself. And you can take one more step out of that door, out of the closet, out of remaining in private. Because frankly, we're scared right now. And I can speak for the community in saying this. And if my podcast helps others, helps you, extend your hand out, show us you care, then mission accomplished. And I'm getting emotional here just talking to everyone right now because this means so much to me. And I care very deeply about our community. So on that note, I thank everybody for listening to my second episode. I hope that it was informative. Everyone out there, Take care.